My daughter said I had nothing worth leaving behind. So I smiled and stayed silent. The day my daughter called my life a failure, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Sometimes the quietest words leave the deepest wounds. "I'm sorry, Dad," Emily said as she looked around my small, aging farmhouse. "But let's be realistic. There's nothing here worth leaving behind." The room fell silent. My son-in-law, Daniel, looked uncomfortable but said nothing. My two grandchildren kept staring at their phones, completely unaware that they had just witnessed a moment I would never forget. I simply smiled, not because her words didn't hurt, because I already knew something she didn't. I poured everyone another cup of coffee. "Maybe you're right," I said calmly. Emily sighed. "Dad, I don't mean to be cruel. I know, you spent your entire life fixing tractors, repairing barns, helping neighbors for almost nothing. You never built a business. You never owned a mansion. You never invested like successful people." She looked around again. "This old house is falling apart." I nodded. "It is. And when you're gone," she hesitated, "there won't really be anything left." Daniel gently whispered, "Emily," but she continued, "I just wish you had thought about your future." I smiled once more. I did. She assumed I meant retirement. She had no idea what those words actually meant. After lunch they left. Emily hugged me before getting into the car. "I worry about you. I know. You don't have to pretend everything is okay." "It is okay." She smiled politely. Then they drove away. As their SUV disappeared down the dusty road, the silence returned. I walked into my workshop. The same workshop where I had spent over 40 years repairing engines. Against the far wall sat an old steel cabinet. Most people thought it contained rusty tools. It didn't. Hidden beneath a false bottom was a small black folder. Inside were documents no one in my family had ever seen. Property deeds, investment statements, bank records, ownership certificates, and one handwritten letter. I closed the folder again. "Not yet," I whispered. The next morning my lawyer called. "Good morning, Thomas." "Morning, Richard. I've finalized everything." "Good. Are you absolutely certain?" "I've never been more certain." Richard paused. "Your daughter still doesn't know?" "No." "And your grandson?" "No." He laughed softly. "They're going to be shocked." "I don't want revenge. I know. I just want them to understand." "They will." Years earlier, most people remembered me as the poor mechanic in town. Few remembered what happened after the recession. Dozens of local farms had gone bankrupt. Families were desperate. Banks were selling land for almost nothing. Everyone else saw worthless fields. I saw opportunity. Every spare dollar I earned repairing machinery went into buying forgotten farmland. Not because I wanted to become rich. Because I believed one day that land would matter again. People laughed. "Thomas is wasting his savings. He'll lose everything. He should buy a new truck instead." I smiled then too. Silence had always been my greatest investment. For 25 years I never sold a single acre. Then the city expanded. Developers arrived. Highways were built. Factories followed. The land everyone mocked suddenly became priceless. Offers began arriving every week. Millions. Then tens of millions. I rejected them all. Not because they weren't enough. Because I had another plan. Meanwhile Emily built her own successful life. She became a corporate executive. Luxury cars, designer clothes, exclusive vacations. She worked incredibly hard, and I was proud of her. But success slowly changed the way she measured people. Everything became numbers, income, status, net worth. If someone didn't display wealth, she assumed they had none. I never corrected her. A month later she invited me to dinner. Their new house looked like something from a magazine. Marble floors, glass walls, an infinity pool overlooking the hills. "Dad," she hugged me. "You finally came." Daniel smiled warmly. "It's great to see you." Dinner was elegant. Conversation wasn't. One of Daniel's business partners asked, "So what did you do before retirement?" "I repaired farm equipment." "Oh." He forced a smile. "Tough way to make a living." "It was honest work." Emily quickly changed the subject. Later I overheard her talking quietly in the kitchen. "I just don't want Dad feeling embarrassed." Daniel replied, "I don't think he's embarrassed." I would be. I quietly walked onto the patio before they noticed me. The stars were beautiful. Money could buy many things. It couldn't improve the night sky. 2 weeks later I visited Richard again. He spread several documents across the conference table. "The charitable trust is complete." "Excellent." "The scholarship fund, established." "The veterans housing project, approved." "The children's hospital donation, ready." Richard leaned back. You realize this will become one of the largest private donations this county has ever seen. Good. And your family, they'll receive what they need. But not everything. No, he nodded. I understand. That evening I drove past several of my old properties. Construction cranes stretched across the horizon. Apartment towers, shopping centers, technology campuses, everything had changed. Except me. I still drove the same old pickup. Still lived in the same farmhouse. Still repaired neighbors' equipment for free whenever they needed help. People assumed I couldn't afford more. The truth was, I simply didn't need more. 3 months later everything changed. It began with one unexpected phone call. Richard's voice sounded unusually serious. Thomas, what happened? We need to meet immediately. Is something wrong? Someone has discovered part of your holdings. I froze. Who? Your daughter. For the first time in many years. I stopped smiling. Thomas arrived at Richard's law office less than 30 minutes after the phone call. His old pickup truck rolled quietly into the parking lot while expensive luxury cars surrounded it. He parked in his usual spot, picked up his worn leather hat, and walked inside. Richard was already waiting. His face carried an expression Thomas had rarely seen in 40 years of friendship. Concern. What happened? Thomas asked as he closed the office door. Richard slid a folder across the desk. I think Emily has started asking questions. Thomas opened the folder. Inside were printed emails from a real estate company. Several developers had recently contacted Richard's office after discovering that one of the largest undeveloped properties outside town belonged to a private family trust. The trust listed only one trustee, Thomas Carter. Thomas remained silent. Richard continued. Apparently one of Emily's business clients is working on the new highway expansion. During their research, they discovered that nearly 1,200 acres in the development zone belong to someone named Thomas Carter. Thomas slowly leaned back. So she knows my name. She knows the owner has your name. But not that it's me. Richard nodded. Not yet. Thomas folded the papers carefully. I suppose the truth was always going to find its way. Richard sighed. The question is, are you ready? Thomas looked out the office window. I've been ready for years. Meanwhile, Emily sat in her corporate office staring at satellite maps on her computer. Her assistant entered. Everything okay? Emily frowned. There's something strange. What is it? You remember the development project outside Green Valley? Yes. The largest private landowner has refused every offer. So, the owner's name is Thomas Carter. Her assistant laughed. That's a common name. Emily smiled nervously. Exactly. Still, something about it bothered her. That evening she called her father. Hi, Dad. Hello, sweetheart. Were you busy? I was repairing Mr. Jenkins' tractor. You still do that? He needed help. You never charge him. He can't afford it. Emily hesitated. Dad, yes, I wanted to ask you something. Thomas waited. Do you know anyone named Thomas Carter besides yourself? He smiled quietly. No, there aren't any relatives with the same name. No. Oh, she almost laughed at herself. What a silly question. Why do you ask? It's nothing. If it's nothing, why does it sound like something? Emily smiled despite herself. You always could tell. She explained about the landowner. Thomas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he simply said, Interesting. You don't seem surprised. I've learned that life is full of surprises. Over the next few weeks Emily became obsessed. Every public property record she could legally access pointed to the same trust. The trust had been created nearly 30 years earlier. No photographs, no interviews, no public appearances, no social media, nothing. It was as if the owner wanted to remain invisible. One evening Daniel noticed stacks of papers covering the dining table. You're still working on that mystery landowner? Emily rubbed her eyes. Something doesn't make sense. What? Someone turned a few $1,000s into hundreds of millions. Daniel whistled softly. Hundreds of millions, possibly more, and no one knows who they are. She shook her head. They never sold anything. Daniel smiled. Sounds like a patient person. Emily looked thoughtful. Very patient. Across town, Thomas continued living exactly as before. He mowed his own lawn, bought groceries at the discount market, drank coffee with retired farmers every Thursday morning. If anyone noticed the old mechanic smiling more than usual, they didn't mention it. One rainy afternoon, Thomas received another visitor. His grandson, Ethan, the 17-year-old, stepped into the workshop carrying 2 milkshakes. Thought you might be thirsty. Thomas smiled. You've grown smarter. I figured food is the fastest way to get Grandpa talking. Thomas laughed. They spent the afternoon rebuilding an old engine together. Unlike many teenagers, Ethan genuinely loved learning with his grandfather. Finally he asked, "Grandpa, yes, can I ask something personal?" "You just did." Ethan grinned. "Mom says you wasted your potential." Thomas continued tightening a bolt. "What do you think?" "I think she's wrong." Thomas looked up. "Why?" "Because every person in town respects you." He shrugged. "They don't respect rich people. They respect you." Thomas felt something warm settle in his heart. "Thank you," Ethan continued. "I don't care if you have $10 or 10 billion. Thomas nearly dropped the wrench. Character matters more. For the first time in years, Thomas had to blink away tears. A week later, the city council announced the final route for the new interstate. News stations exploded with headlines. Property values doubled overnight. Developers became desperate. One company offered nearly 4,500 crore rupees for Thomas's largest property. Richard called immediately. "They've increased the offer again." Thomas smiled. "Decline it. They won't stop asking." "I know. They think everyone has a price." Thomas answered, quietly. "They're mistaken." Emily watched the same news report on television. The reporter said, the anonymous landowner could become one of the richest individuals in the entire state. She stared at the screen. Something inside her whispered that this story wasn't over. Not even close. The next morning, she made a decision that would change everything. She was going to visit the county records office herself. And hidden in one forgotten document, she was about to discover a signature that would make her heart stop. The county records office opened at exactly 9 o'clock. Emily was already waiting outside. She had barely slept the night before. Something deep inside her refused to let the mystery go. As soon as the doors opened, she walked to the information desk. "I'd like to view the ownership records for the Green Valley Development Trust." The clerk nodded politely. "It may take a few minutes." Emily sat down, tapping her fingers nervously. 20 minutes later, the clerk returned with a thick archive file. "Here you are." Emily thanked him and opened the first page. The trust had been established nearly 30 years earlier. She turned another page, then another. Most of the documents were routine legal filings. Until she reached the final page. At the bottom was a familiar signature. Thomas A. Carter. Her breathing stopped. She looked again. The signature matched the one on every birthday card her father had ever written. "No," she whispered. "This can't be." She hurried back to the clerk. "Are you sure these records are correct?" The clerk adjusted his glasses. "Yes, ma'am, they've been verified many times." Emily's hands began to shake. She thanked him and walked slowly to her car. For several minutes, she simply sat behind the steering wheel. Every conversation with her father replayed in her mind. "Maybe you're right, I did think about my future. Life is full of surprises." Suddenly, every one of those quiet smiles meant something entirely different. That evening, Emily drove straight to her father's farmhouse. Thomas was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset with a cup of coffee. He smiled when he saw her car. "You're here earlier than usual." She stepped out without saying a word. Her eyes searched his face. Finally, she asked, "Dad." "Yes, who are you?" Thomas looked at her kindly. "The same man I've always been." She held up the copied document. "I found this." He glanced at the paper. "I wondered how long it would take." "So, it's true." He nodded. "Yes. The trust belongs to you." "Yes. The land, mine." Emily stared at him in disbelief. "How much is it worth?" Thomas looked toward the distant hills. "I stopped counting years ago." Tears filled her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" He answered softly, "Because you never asked who I was. You only asked what I owned." Those words struck harder than any argument ever could. Emily lowered her head. I know what you thought. I believed you had nothing." Thomas smiled gently. And now, she couldn't answer. The next morning, news began spreading through the town. Someone had leaked information about the anonymous landowner. Local reporters gathered outside the county offices. Developers rushed to arrange meetings. Within hours, Thomas Carter's quiet life had become front-page news. Neighbors were stunned. "The old mechanic? No way, he fixed my tractor last month. I thought he barely had enough to live on." Everyone had believed the same story. Everyone except Thomas. Daniel arrived at the farmhouse later that afternoon. He stood awkwardly beside the porch. "I owe you an apology." Thomas invited him to sit. "You've never treated me badly. I should have spoken up when Emily judged you." Thomas smiled. "It takes courage to correct the people we love." Daniel nodded. "I'm learning that." Meanwhile, Richard called with urgent news. Thomas, every developer in the state wants a meeting. I'm not interested. They've doubled their offers. No, tripled. Thomas laughed quietly. My answer hasn't changed. Richard paused. There's something else. What is it? A national investment company wants to buy everything. Thomas looked across the fields he had cared for most of his life. I didn't protect this land for 30 years just to sell it to the highest bidder. So what will you do? Thomas smiled. I'll do what I planned from the beginning. And what's that? I'm going to give most of it away. Richard was silent. Even after knowing Thomas for 4 decades, he was still amazed. That evening, Emily returned once more. This time, she didn't come with questions. She came with tears. She sat beside her father on the porch. I'm sorry. Thomas remained quiet. I judged your life by things I could see. She wiped away a tear. I never noticed everything you had built in silence. Thomas placed a gentle hand on hers. The greatest wealth isn't what people admire. It's what remains after you're gone. Emily looked at him. What do you mean? Thomas smiled. You'll find out soon. 3 days later, elegant invitations were delivered across the county. Business leaders, judges, teachers, veterans, hospital directors, charity organizers, and every member of Thomas's family received one. The invitation contained only one sentence. Please join me on Saturday afternoon as I reveal the purpose of my life's work. No one knew what to expect, but by the end of that gathering, the entire family would witness a revelation that would change their lives forever. Saturday arrived beneath a clear blue sky. By noon, the town's historic community hall was filled beyond capacity. Luxury cars lined the street beside old pickup trucks. Business executives sat next to retired farmers. Teachers, veterans, doctors, pastors, and lifelong neighbors whispered among themselves, wondering why the quiet mechanic had invited them all. At the front of the room stood a simple wooden podium. There were no decorations, no banners, no display of wealth, just a single microphone in a large wooden box placed on a nearby table. Emily sat in the front row with Daniel, Ethan, and the rest of the family. She could feel dozens of curious eyes looking toward them. At exactly 1 o'clock, Thomas walked onto the stage wearing the same neatly pressed blue shirt he had worn for years. The room fell silent. He smiled warmly. Thank you for coming. His calm voice echoed through the hall. I've spent most of my life avoiding attention. Today is different, because today isn't about me. He paused. It's about what remains after a person is gone. Everyone listened closely. I've been called many things over the years. A poor mechanic, an old farmer, a man who never became successful. A few people lowered their heads. Thomas wasn't accusing anyone, he was simply telling the truth. I never argued with those opinions. He looked toward Emily. Sometimes silence teaches lessons that words cannot. Emily felt tears gathering in her eyes. Thomas continued, when I was young, my father told me something I never forgot. He smiled. He said, if your wealth needs to be displayed, it probably isn't your greatest wealth. The audience remained completely still. For 30 years I quietly purchased farmland that nobody wanted. People laughed. They thought I was making foolish decisions. A projector behind him lit up. Old photographs appeared on the screen. Run-down fields, broken fences, abandoned barns. Then newer photographs followed. Schools, parks, hospitals, homes, entire communities that now stood on land Thomas had once protected. Gasps spread across the room. Thomas looked at the audience. I never bought land to become famous. I bought it because I believed one day it could help people. Richard, his attorney, walked onto the stage carrying several thick folders. Thomas nodded. Richard, would you please explain? Richard adjusted his glasses. After many years of planning, Mr. Thomas Carter has created the Carter Community Foundation. The audience became silent once again. This foundation will receive the majority of his estate. People exchanged confused looks. Richard opened the first folder. Beginning immediately, a new children's hospital will be funded. Applause erupted. Richard opened another folder. 500 full university scholarships will be awarded over the next 20 years to students from low-income families. More applause. Another folder. A veterans housing program will be established. Another. A free agricultural training center. Another. Emergency medical assistance for elderly residents. Another. Community libraries. Another. Food assistance programs. Many people were now wiping away tears. Emily covered her mouth with both hands. She had imagined her father secretly living like a millionaire. She had never imagined he intended to give almost everything away. Richard looked toward Thomas. There is one final announcement. The room became completely quiet. Thomas stepped forward. My family has always been important to me. Emily looked down. But love is not measured by inheritance. He slowly opened the wooden box resting on the table. Inside were dozens of handwritten journals. I've spent 40 years writing these. He picked up one notebook. They contain every mistake I made. Another. Every lesson I learned. Another. Every dream. Another. And every reason I chose kindness over revenge. He smiled at Ethan. My greatest inheritance isn't money. It's wisdom. He handed the journals to his grandson. Ethan. The young man stood, surprised. I want you to keep these. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say. Thomas smiled, live in a way that adds something worth writing about. The hall erupted into applause. Emily could no longer hold back her emotions. She walked onto the stage. Before hundreds of people, she embraced her father tightly. I'm so sorry. Thomas hugged her back. I know. I judged you. I know. I was ashamed of your simple life. Thomas gently wiped away one of her tears. But you're not ashamed anymore. She shook her head. No, I've never been more proud to be your daughter. The audience stood to their feet. Many applauded. Others cried openly. Even Richard removed his glasses to wipe away tears. That afternoon, the town didn't remember Thomas Carter as the richest man in the county. They remembered him as the kindest. And as the family walked out of the hall together, Emily finally understood what her father had known all along. A fortune can change lives. But a humble heart can change generations. The standing ovation had barely ended when Richard's phone began vibrating. He glanced at the screen, frowned, and quietly stepped outside the hall. When he returned a few minutes later, the smile had disappeared from his face. Thomas, he said softly, we need to talk. Now. Thomas excused himself from the guests and followed Richard into a private meeting room. What happened? Richard placed his phone on the table. News of your announcement has spread across the country. Since this morning, my office has received more than 300 calls. Thomas smiled faintly. I expected interest. This isn't interest. Richard took a deep breath. It's a fight. Within hours, powerful developers, investment firms, and land brokers had begun competing for the Carter properties. Some offered unbelievable amounts of money. Others hinted at lawsuits if the land remained unavailable. They think they can pressure you, Richard said. Thomas calmly folded his hands. They've spent their lives believing everything has a price. And does this? Thomas looked out the window. No. Outside, reporters surrounded Emily. Did you know your father was worth hundreds of millions? No. What will happen to the estate? I don't know. Will your family inherit everything? Emily looked directly into the cameras. My father's greatest gift isn't money. The reporters became silent. It's the example he has given us. Watching from inside the hall, Thomas smiled with quiet pride. For the first time in years, Emily wasn't thinking about wealth. She was thinking about values. That evening, Thomas returned to his farmhouse. The porch light was already on. Someone was waiting. An expensive black SUV stood in the driveway. A sharply dressed man stepped forward. Mr. Carter. Yes. My name is Victor Hayes. Thomas shook his hand politely. I represent North Horizon Development. I've heard of your company. Victor smiled confidently. My clients would like to purchase your complete land portfolio. I'm not selling. You haven't heard the offer. I don't need to. Victor opened a briefcase. The offer is 8,000 crore rupees. Thomas didn't even look inside. My answer is still no. Victor blinked. Perhaps you misunderstood. No. This is one of the largest private offers ever made. Thomas smiled. And still not enough. Victor's confident expression began to fade. Everyone has a number. Thomas looked toward the old oak tree planted by his late wife decades earlier. My wife planted that tree with our children. He pointed toward the surrounding fields. My father taught me to work this soil. He looked back at Victor. Tell me, what price would you accept for your happiest memories? Victor had no answer. Thomas gently closed the briefcase. Good night. The following morning, Ethan arrived carrying breakfast. I figured reporters would show up. Thomas laughed. They're already here. Outside the gate, television vans lined the road. Cameras waited for a glimpse of the mysterious millionaire mechanic. Ethan looked uncomfortable. Doesn't this bother you? Thomas sipped his coffee. They're interested in my money. They should be interested in your character. Thomas smiled. Character takes longer to notice. Meanwhile, Emily made a decision. She drove to every place her father had secretly helped over the years. The local food bank, the veterans center, The old elementary school, the volunteer fire station, everywhere she went, people told the same story. When our roof collapsed, your father paid for repairs. He bought school supplies every year. He paid my medical bills after my husband died. He never wanted anyone to know. Emily felt tears forming again. None of these acts had ever appeared on social media. There were no newspaper articles. No awards. He had helped because people needed help. Not because anyone was watching. Late that afternoon, Richard arrived with another stack of documents. I've completed the final review. Thomas nodded. And, Richard hesitated. There's one condition in your will that no one knows about. Thomas smiled. Leave it exactly as written. Even your family, especially my family. Richard looked surprised. You believe they'll accept it? They'll understand. That night, Emily sat alone looking through old family photographs. She found one taken when she was 8 years old. Her father stood beside an old tractor, smiling in dusty work clothes. As a child, she had thought he looked like the strongest man in the world. Somewhere along the way, she had forgotten. She quietly whispered into the empty room, "I'm going to make you proud, Dad." The next morning brought unexpected news. Richard called before sunrise. "Thomas, good morning. I wish it were." "What happened?" Richard's voice was unusually tense. "Someone has officially challenged your foundation." Thomas stood silently. "Who?" Richard answered slowly. "A man claiming to be your late brother's son." Thomas's expression changed instantly. "My brother never had children. That's exactly why we have a problem." Richard took a deep breath. "He says he has documents proving he's the rightful heir to part of your estate." Thomas looked toward the rising sun beyond the fields. After years of peace, a battle he never expected was about to begin. The phone slipped from Thomas's hand and landed softly on the kitchen table. For nearly 30 years, he had lived a peaceful life, avoiding conflict. Now, a stranger claimed to be part of his family. He stared out the window as the morning sun rose over the fields he had spent a lifetime protecting. Could someone really be telling the truth? Or was this simply another attempt to steal what he had built? An hour later, Thomas sat across from Richard in his law office. Richard laid several documents on the desk. "The man's name is Michael Lawson." Thomas studied the file. "I've never heard that name. He claims your older brother, Samuel Carter, secretly had a son before leaving town." Thomas shook his head slowly. "My brother disappeared 40 years ago. We searched everywhere." Richard nodded. "I know. He never contacted us again. That's what makes this claim unusual." Richard slid a faded birth certificate across the desk. "It appears genuine." Thomas frowned. "Appearances can be deceiving." Meanwhile, the media had discovered the legal dispute. News vans once again surrounded the Carter farmhouse. Headlines flashed across television screens. "Mystery heir challenges millionaire mechanic's estate." Emily watched the coverage with growing anxiety. She immediately drove to her father's house. When she arrived, Thomas was repairing an old wooden fence as if nothing had happened. "Dad," he smiled. "Good morning. You've seen the news." "I have. Aren't you worried?" Thomas gently hammered another nail into place. "Worry has never solved a problem." Emily looked at him in disbelief. "How can you stay so calm?" He smiled. "Because the truth doesn't change simply because someone questions it." That afternoon, Richard arranged a private meeting. Michael Lawson entered the conference room wearing an expensive suit. He appeared to be in his early 40s. His confidence filled the room. Thomas stood and extended his hand. "If you truly are family, welcome." Michael looked surprised. "You don't hate me." Thomas smiled. "I don't know you well enough." Michael hesitated before shaking his hand. For a brief moment, the tension eased. Richard began. "Mr. Lawson, you've submitted documents claiming you're Samuel Carter's biological son." "That's correct. You understand these claims must be verified." "I expected that." Michael placed several old photographs on the table. Thomas picked one up. It showed his brother Samuel as a young man. Standing beside him was a woman Thomas had never seen, holding a baby. Thomas's hands trembled slightly. Could it really be? Michael spoke quietly. "My mother never wanted money." Thomas listened carefully. "She said my father left before I was born." "What happened to her?" "She raised me alone." "And why come now?" Michael looked down. "Because I only learned the truth 6 months ago after my mother's death." Silence filled the room. Thomas couldn't tell whether the man was lying or telling the truth. Later that evening, Ethan joined his grandfather on the porch. "You think he's real?" Thomas sighed. "I honestly don't know. What if he is?" Thomas smiled gently. Then I'll be grateful I have another member of the family. Ethan looked confused. Even if it costs you millions. Thomas laughed softly. Ethan, yes, if money can destroy a family. It was never holding that family together. Across town, Emily couldn't stop thinking. She realized that only weeks earlier she would have viewed Michael as an enemy. Now, she found herself hoping the truth would come out, whatever that truth happened to be. Her father's quiet strength was changing everyone around him. 3 days later, the DNA test was completed. Richard called everyone to his office. Thomas, Emily, Daniel, Ethan, Michael. The room felt impossibly quiet. Richard opened the sealed envelope. He adjusted his glasses. This report confirms, everyone held their breath, that Michael Lawson is not biologically related to Samuel Carter or the Carter family. The room fell silent. Michael closed his eyes. I was afraid of that. Thomas looked at him carefully. You already knew. Michael nodded slowly. I suspected my mother had been deceived. Richard frowned. Then why file the legal claim? Michael's eyes filled with tears. Because I wanted answers. I spent my entire life believing I belonged somewhere. No one spoke. For the first time, Thomas saw not a fraud, but a man who had grown up searching for his identity. Thomas stood, walked across the room, and placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. You may not carry our name, but no one deserves to spend life wondering where they belong. Michael looked up, stunned. I don't understand. Thomas smiled warmly. You came here looking for a family. He paused. You've just found friends. Tears rolled down Michael's face. Even Richard was speechless. Emily quietly wiped away her own tears. Her father had once again chosen compassion over anger. As everyone prepared to leave, Richard received another urgent phone call. His expression changed instantly. He looked at Thomas. This isn't over. What now? Richard answered in a low voice. The government has announced a compulsory acquisition proposal affecting part of your land. Thomas looked toward the window. For the first time, the greatest challenge of his life wasn't coming from his family. It was coming from outside. The phone call from Richard changed everything. Thomas had faced criticism, misunderstanding, and even a false inheritance claim without losing his calm. But this time, the challenge was different. It involved the government. Richard spread several official documents across the conference table. The Department of Infrastructure has announced a compulsory acquisition proposal, he explained. They want nearly 400 acres of your land for a new transportation and industrial corridor. Thomas carefully read every page. Can they do that? They have legal authority in certain circumstances, Richard replied. But the proposal can still be challenged, negotiated, or modified. Thomas looked up. I'm not worried about the money. I know. I'm worried about the people. Richard nodded. He knew exactly what Thomas meant. The proposed project would also affect dozens of small farming families who leased land from the Carter Foundation at affordable rates. That afternoon, Thomas drove across the countryside. He stopped at each farm. At the first house, an elderly couple greeted him with worried faces. Mr. Carter, the farmer said quietly, they told us we may have to leave. Thomas placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. No one will face this alone. At another farm, a young couple stood beside their children. We just finished paying off our equipment, the husband said. If we lose this land, we'll lose everything. Thomas listened to every story. He made no promises he couldn't keep. But before leaving each family, he said the same words. I'll fight for what's right. That evening, Emily joined her father on the porch. I visited the families today, she said softly. Thomas looked at her. What did you see? I saw fear. She sat beside him. I used to think success meant earning more. She looked across the fields. Now I think success means making sure other people don't lose hope. Thomas smiled. You've learned the lesson I spent my whole life trying to teach. Emily leaned her head gently against his shoulder. I'm sorry it took me so long. It arrived exactly when it needed to. A week later, the town council held a public meeting. The hall was packed. Government officials explained the benefits of the new project. More jobs, new businesses, improved roads. But when local families stood to speak, the room grew emotional. One farmer said, my family has lived here for 4 generations. Another added, we're not against progress. We just don't want to lose our future. Then the mayor invited Thomas to the microphone. The hall became silent. Thomas looked around the room. I believe communities should grow. He paused. I also believe people should never be treated like obstacles. The audience listened carefully. If this project truly benefits everyone, Then let's build it in a way that protects the families who built this town. Applause filled the hall. Even several officials nodded in agreement. The following day, Richard arrived with surprising news. The government wants to negotiate. Thomas smiled. That's better than fighting. They've asked if you'll meet their planning committee. When? Tomorrow morning. The meeting lasted nearly 6 hours. Instead of demanding more compensation, Thomas made a different request. I don't need a larger payment, he said. I want written guarantees. The officials exchanged puzzled looks. What kind of guarantees? Thomas answered calmly. No farming family currently leasing my land will be left without a home. He continued. Every affected family must receive fair relocation assistance, replacement farmland where possible, and support during the transition. The room fell silent. One senior official finally spoke. Most people negotiate for themselves. Thomas smiled. I'm negotiating for my neighbors. Several weeks later, the revised agreement was announced. The transportation project would move forward, but every family on Carter Foundation land would receive protection under the new plan. No one would be forced out without support. The town celebrated. Many credited Thomas for refusing to think only about himself. That evening, Ethan walked through the old workshop. Grandpa, yes, when all this is over, what are you going to do? Thomas looked around the familiar room. I'll probably repair tractors. Ethan laughed. You'll still do that? Thomas grinned. People still break tractors. They both laughed. Just as the family believed life was finally becoming peaceful again, Richard's assistant rushed into his office carrying a sealed envelope. It was delivered by courier. Richard opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter and an old black and white photograph. The photograph showed a young Thomas standing beside a man no one in the family had ever seen. The letter contained only one sentence. The promise you made in 1985 has come due. It's time to tell your family the whole truth. Richard immediately called Thomas. There's something in your past. Thomas looked at the old photograph. His calm expression disappeared. For the first time in decades. He whispered, I hope this day would never come. Thomas stared at the old black and white photograph for several long moments. The room was silent. Emily had never seen that expression on her father's face before. It wasn't fear, it was sorrow. He carefully picked up the photograph. The young man standing beside him wore a military uniform. They were both smiling. Dad, Emily asked softly, who is he? Thomas took a slow breath. His name was James Walker. You've never mentioned him. I couldn't. Why not? Thomas looked down. Because every time I remembered him, I remembered the promise I made. The family gathered around the dining table that evening. Richard placed the mysterious letter in the center. Thomas finally began to speak. 41 years ago, before I bought my first piece of land, I was struggling to keep this farm alive. I had almost nothing. I was ready to sell everything. Emily listened without saying a word. One evening, my truck broke down during a storm. I was stranded on a lonely highway. James stopped to help me. Thomas smiled faintly. He was on his way home after finishing military service. He could have kept driving. But he didn't. For hours, James helped repair the truck. The two strangers became friends. Before leaving, James said something Thomas never forgot. If life ever gives you more than you need, make sure someone else receives what they need. Thomas looked toward the window. 3 months later, he died in a road accident. The room became completely silent. I attended his funeral. I met his young wife. And their little daughter. Emily wiped away a tear. They had almost nothing. Thomas nodded. I promised James that if I ever became successful, I would quietly watch over his family. Richard opened another folder. Thomas kept that promise. Emily looked surprised. What do you mean? Richard spread several documents across the table. For more than 35 years, he secretly paid for the daughter's education. He helped with medical expenses. He paid off their home loan. He even funded her college degree. Emily covered her mouth in shock. They never knew. Thomas shook his head. They believed anonymous donors were helping. Daniel spoke quietly. So the letter. Thomas nodded. They've finally discovered who the anonymous donor was. Ethan smiled. They want to thank you. Thomas looked thoughtful. I hope that's all they want. The next afternoon, a woman in her early 40s arrived at the farmhouse. Her name was Sarah Walker. She stepped out of her car carrying a small wooden box. The moment she saw Thomas, tears filled her eyes. Mr. Carter. Thomas smiled. You must be Sarah. She nodded. I've wanted to meet you my entire life. She hugged him tightly. I finally know. Thomas gently smiled. Know what? You kept your promise to my father. Sarah opened the wooden box. Inside was James Walker's military medal. My father always believed kindness would come back one day. She placed the medal in Thomas's hands. He would have wanted you to have this. Thomas slowly shook his head. No, it belongs to your family. Sarah smiled through her tears. My father earned it. She gently closed Thomas's fingers around it. But you honored it. The family watched quietly. Emily had never seen her father accept praise comfortably. He simply whispered, I only did what I promised. Sarah smiled. Most people forget promises. You built an entire life around one. Later that evening, Sarah joined the family. For dinner, she laughed with Ethan. She shared stories about her father. For the first time in decades, Thomas spoke openly about his younger years. Emily realized there had always been chapters of her father's life she had never bothered to ask about. Not because he was hiding them, but because she had assumed there was nothing worth hearing. She now understood how wrong she had been. A few days later, Richard called again. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. Thomas, yes, the Carter Community Foundation has received something unexpected. What is it? More than 100 local business owners have pledged donations. Thomas smiled. Why? They said your example inspired them. The donations continued arriving throughout the week. Farmers, teachers, doctors, retired couples, even schoolchildren emptied their piggy banks into the foundation's donation boxes. The movement had become bigger than one man. It had become a community. One quiet evening, Ethan asked his grandfather, Grandpa, what's the greatest investment you ever made? Thomas looked toward the sunset. It wasn't the land. It wasn't the money. What was it? Thomas smiled warmly, choosing kindness, even when nobody was watching. Ethan nodded, knowing he would remember those words forever. But just as peace seemed to have returned, Richard's phone rang once more. He answered, listened carefully, then looked at Thomas with a stunned expression. The national government has announced the Carter Community Foundation as the recipient of one of the country's highest public service honors. Thomas quietly lowered his coffee cup. He had spent his entire life avoiding recognition. Now, the announcement spread across the country within hours. Every major news channel carried the same headline. Retired mechanic honored for a lifetime of quiet generosity. Television crews filled the road leading to Thomas Carter's farmhouse. People who had never heard his name before now wanted interviews. But when reporters knocked on his front door, they found only a handwritten note. Kindness doesn't need a camera to be real. The note quickly went viral. Millions of people shared it online. A week later, the Carter family traveled to the national capital for the award ceremony. Thomas wore the same simple navy suit he had owned for years. Emily smiled at him. Dad, we could have bought you a new suit. Thomas chuckled. This one still fits. Daniel laughed. That's the most grandpa answer ever. Even Ethan couldn't stop smiling. The grand ceremony was held in a magnificent hall filled with judges, community leaders, military veterans, teachers, doctors, and business owners. As Thomas entered, the audience stood and applauded. He looked embarrassed. Richard leaned over and whispered, You've faced billionaires without blinking. Thomas smiled. But applause makes me nervous. The host stepped to the podium. Today, we honor a man who proved that true wealth is measured not by what we keep, but by what we give. A large screen behind the stage began showing photographs from Thomas's life. His old workshop, his farmhouse, children studying with Carter Foundation scholarships, veterans receiving new homes, families rebuilding their lives, community parks, libraries, hospitals. Emily watched in silence. She realized that she knew only a small part of her father's story. When Thomas's name was called, he slowly walked onto the stage. The hall became completely silent. The presenter handed him the medal. Carter Community Foundation has changed thousands of lives. Thomas accepted the honor with both hands. Then he stepped toward the microphone. I don't deserve this alone. Everyone listened. I've met farmers who shared their last meal with strangers. I've seen teachers spend their own salaries on children. I've watched nurses stay long after their shifts ended. He paused. If you wish to honor me. His voice softened. Go home and help someone who cannot repay you. The audience erupted into applause. Many people stood. Some wiped away tears. Later that evening, Emily and Thomas walked through the gardens outside the hall. The city lights sparkled around them. Emily broke the silence. Dad, yes, I used to believe success meant people recognizing your name. Thomas smiled. And now, I think success is hearing your name spoken with gratitude. Thomas nodded. That's a better measure. Back home, life slowly returned to normal. Thomas was happiest in his workshop. One afternoon, a young boy arrived pushing an old bicycle. "Mr. Carter." Thomas looked up. "Looks like that bike has seen better days." The boy smiled shyly. "My mom said you might know how to fix it." Thomas winked. "Let's find out." Emily watched quietly from the doorway. The richest man in the county was repairing a child's bicycle without charging a single rupee. She smiled to herself. Some people collected money. Her father collected reasons to smile. Several months later, the Carter Community Foundation held its first scholarship ceremony. 500 students filled the auditorium. Many were the first in their families to attend college. Thomas stood before them. "I have only one request." The students leaned forward. "When life becomes kind to you," he smiled, "be kind to someone else." Every student stood and applauded. Many promised they would. As the ceremony ended, Ethan walked beside his grandfather. "Grandpa." "Yes. Do you think people will remember you?" Thomas looked toward the smiling students. "I hope they remember the lesson, not the man." Ethan nodded. "I'll remember both." Thomas placed an arm around his grandson's shoulders. "Then my work is done." That evening, the entire Carter family gathered on the porch of the old farmhouse. The sun slowly disappeared behind the fields that had started everything decades earlier. Emily looked at her father. "I once believed you had nothing worth leaving behind." Thomas smiled gently. And now, she looked around at her family, the land, the foundation, and the community that loved him. "You've left something money could never buy." Thomas quietly closed his eyes for a moment. A peaceful breeze moved through the old oak tree planted by his late wife many years before. He whispered, "Then I've lived a good life." The family sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sunset. For the first time in many years, no one spoke about money. No one spoke about inheritance. They spoke only about family. And in that moment, Emily finally understood the greatest fortune her father had ever possessed. It wasn't hidden in bank accounts. It wasn't buried beneath the land. It was found in every life he had quietly changed.